Okay. Hi, everyone. Wow. Welcome. Welcome to this, the last MBF Plus event of 2020. This event is taking place in partnership with Fact and Fiction Books here in Missoula, Montana, and with the Adroit Journal, which is a journal kind of everywhere. My name is Lauren Korn. I'm the director of the Montana Book Festival. I'm so pleased and excited to host This Land Is Not Your Land, a conversation with C Pam Zhang. This event was slated for September's festival, actually, many of you will know that, but it was rescheduled due to illness. But we're so happy that it's taking place at long last. I'm so excited for this conversation. I have a little bit of housekeeping before we officially begin. If you're interested in purchasing copies of Pam's How Much of These Hills is Gold, I urge you to purchase them from our festival partner, Fact and Fiction Books, who has agreed to donate 10% of all book sales of festival titles, both this title or all titles, back to the festival, which is amazing. So go to factandfictionbooks.com and be sure to enter MBF when you check out, so that 10% can make its way back to us so that we can continue programming like this. And then finally, audience, feel free to submit your questions to Pam and Jenny via the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Here on the back end of things, we'll be reading your questions. Feel free to chat in the chat function. I'll be sending out some links for you, but do be sure to kind of relegate your questions to the Q&A. Jenny and Pam will address those questions the latter part of the conversation. I'd like to introduce to you all Garrett Biggs, who's then going to introduce Pam and Jenny. So Garrett Biggs' most recent fiction appears in Black Warrior Review and The Offing, among other wonderful publications. He is the managing editor of the Adroit Journal and is a recent graduate of the MFA program at the University of Colorado Boulder. More of his work can be found at garrettbiggs.net or on Twitter at garrettbiggs. Welcome, Garrett.
Thank you, Lauren. And thank you to Montana Book Fair or Book Festival rather for inviting us at the Adroit Journal to join in hosting this event. My name is Garrett and I'm managing editor and director of programs at Adroit, and I'm also less formally a #1 fan for these two writers who I am going to be introducing this evening. Between Pam's brilliant novel, How Much of These Hills is Gold, and Jenny's work as a columnist at Catapult, one of the first things that will come to mind when regarding these writers is their shared interest in the spaces of the American West. And I'm sure there will be some talk of that this evening. But I also would be remiss if I didn't comment on the fact that through their novels, they were able to give me personally two of my favorite reading experiences during this past year. What I think I credit most to this is the ebullient quality imbued through their prose. It's atmospheric, but it's sharp, it's muscular and familiar, but it's also unlike anything you've probably read before. And and they're very different writers too. There's some really great energy that I think will contribute to a wonderful conversation. So in C Pam Zhang's novel, How Much of These Hills is Gold, which she will be in conversation with Jenny about this evening, she tells the story of two orphans, Lucy and Sam, who set off to bury their father in a Western landscape that is historical and perhaps for that very reason, strange. A landscape of buffalo bones and tiger paw prints, hauntings and haints. To use the author Aro Kwan's words, it's a miracle as timely as it is timeless. I'm going to leave the remainder of the talking to these two writers because I mostly want to listen to what they have to say. But first, I do want to give you their bios. Born between Beijing, but mostly an artifact of the United States, C Pam Zhang has lived in 13 cities across 4 countries and is still looking for home. She's been awarded support from Tin House, Bread Loaf, Aspen Words, and elsewhere, and currently lives in San Francisco. And Jenny Tinghui Zhang is a Chinese-American writer based in Austin and a prose editor for the Adroit Journal. Her work has appeared in Catapult, Apogee, The Cut, Passages North, and The Rumpus, among others. Her debut novel is forthcoming from Flatiron Books in 2022, and it's so good. I can't wait for you all to read it. Anyway, Jenny, if you want to take it away now.
Yay, thank you so much, Garrett, and thank you to the Montana Book Festival for having us and for rescheduling us, and hello to everyone watching. Pam, hi, I'm so excited to talk to you about your book.
muted. I was just saying, yes, I am so delighted to be here as well, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation.
Yay. My first question is not much about the book, but more so like, how are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a very weird year, and I can't believe that we're at the end of it right now. It's funny, as Garrett was reading the bio, I was like, wow, so many things have changed. I don't even live in San Francisco anymore. I've moved sort of up the West Coast. I'm in Washington State now. But I don't even know what to say about this year. I think I'm okay. I'm great. I have all the material comforts that I could want, but I think, like many of us, I can't wait for 2021 so we can turn over a new leaf.
Yes, and as we were discussing before we went live, congratulations on being longlisted for the Booker Prize and all of the other awards and accolades that you've received for this beautiful book. And also, of course, one of Obama's favorite books of 2020, which we were just saying, like, what an influencer moment.
Yeah, Obama, the ultimate influencer. It's very surreal.
Yes. So I was thinking we could structure this by first talking about the book. I have some questions for you, of course, and talking about just like how we're thinking about history and what it means to belong in the West. And then, of course, we will take viewer questions that you can put in the chat, and I will try to get to them towards the end of our talk. So how much of these hills is gold? I have an ARC, so it might look a little different, but I've read this book 3 times now, and every single time I feel like I walk away discovering something new about it. And this most recent time, it was just appreciating the ending so much. Whereas the first few times, I think I was just so heartbroken. But this time it felt almost like ebullient in a way, which we can talk about later. But I also felt very grateful because my novel the one that I'm working on right now, deals with the 1880s in Idaho. So also set in the West around this time of like great anti-Chinese sentiment. And reading this book and seeing like the stories of Chinese Americans and their experiences in America during this time, which hasn't really been written about, and not many people know this history. I was just really grateful that you wrote this book the way that you did. So thank you for giving us this gift.
Thank you for reading it. It's such an honor to be read 3 times.
It was very enjoyable every single time, and like truly heartbreaking every single time. So my first question, I've been reading a lot of interviews that you've done, and I realized that you arrived at this novel via a short story. Like the first chapter is actually a short story. And I was wondering if you could kind of take us through, like, how did you arrive at that short story to begin with? And then what like propelled it into a novel?
Yeah, so it's funny because I think that mostly I caution against the idea of trying deliberately to find a short story that you've written and then turn it into a novel. So it's pretty funny to me that this is where I ended up. But when it was a short story, it began the way all my short stories do, which is with an opening image. I saw this image of dry heat and golden hills and these 2 children on the run. And that's where it goes. When I'm writing a short story, I'm just pursuing images. I'm just really letting the lusciousness of sort of like image after image and scene under scene unfold. So there's no great answer. I think that when I sort of like peel back the layers, what I often feel is that the subconscious reason this short story came into being, the short story, which is sort of, I suppose you could call the introduction to the world that becomes the world of the novel, it came into existence because I was living abroad at the time. I moved around a lot, but I spent a good chunk of my adolescence in Northern California, which the book is loosely based off of. And I've always had a very conflicted, sort of tortured relationship with that location. And I was living in Bangkok, Thailand. I had just left Northern California again. And I think it was after probably 4-ish months of being away from there, that in a way the landscape sort of began to haunt me. It was really the first time in my life where I was thinking, maybe I don't want to move back there. I have roots, my family is there, but I don't know if I want to live there for the rest of my life. And it was, I think, these sort of subconscious murmurings that were happening.
Sometimes it feels like you can't even write about a place until you've left it almost.
Oh yes, I would love to hear about your experience with that, but that's definitely true for me. I mean, every single writer is different, but sometimes I wake up and I can't believe that I wrote what is, labeled historical fiction, because as a fiction writer, I don't hate facts, but I find that they can be a bit strangling. You can easily fall into that sort of rut of, I have all these facts, now I have to put them in a shape. And then it becomes, as a fiction writer, it becomes an exercise in trying to work with the facts instead of trying to, tell a story first and then make the facts work with it.
Yeah, I have run into that same problem of like, you have to do a lot of research for this time period. And there comes a point where you almost do too much research and it impedes the writing and like the actual creation of everything. So I'm kind of curious actually, like, what was your relationship to research like for this book?
Yeah, I think that the sort of mantra I've developed is that I suppose that before anything of your life can go into a work of fiction, it has to be sort of metabolized first. Emotions have to be metabolized, and facts have to be metabolized too. So because I went through the California public school system for a number of years, I actually had this foundational knowledge of the landscape and of the gold rush happening in California. So, I wasn't by any means like a professional historian, but I had a kind of a base story about this era in my head already. And so when I started out to write this book, again, it felt sort of like this fever dream that was drawing on these, like, by that point, they really felt more like mythologies than, like a specific date of the California gold rush that I could cite. And I was drawing on this kind of like storyscape that I had picked up over many, many, many years. And I wrote that first draft of the novel first without sort of fact checking. And then it was actually in the revision process. I sort of like put that draft away. I let it marinate and I started reading more. I read this really wonderful book by this writer named Helen Zia called Asian American Dreams. That is about these sort of successive waves of different Asian immigration to the United States. I read, a lot of Wikipedia articles. I was also reading, in terms of research, I was also reading some of the books of the Western genre for the first time, or again, I was reading Mary McMurtry's Lonesome Dove, and all of those things kind of became one thing for me. They were all funneling back into the book. So that was the point at which I drew upon specific historical dates. For example, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, right, where I'm sure you know that, but there's this very famous image where they sort of ceremonially hammer the last spike that completes the railroad. And in the image, there's not a single Chinese laborer, though it was Chinese laborers that were responsible for a great deal of the final legs of the work. And so it wasn't that I wrote a book around that image, but it's more like when I looked at the draft of the book I had written, and then when I looked at the facts, there were already these resonances. Like that already said something about what my book was trying to say, about, being left out of a dominant narrative, about, the end of wilderness and civilization. And so I kind of used the facts that I wanted to use, the ones that sort of served me.
Yeah, and I think I read in an interview you did where you were talking about like how closely do we need to stick to the facts and to the research, and you were saying that in a way like you kind of rejected the notion of having to abide by like what is too factual or historically accurate, because so many of those records are written by white people, and like what gets rewritten, what gets left out. And so I think in the interview you said like you were trying to get away from that and by just like kind of creating what you knew.
Yeah, I think so. We have to remember too that historical fiction is, at the end of the day, it's fiction. We go to fiction as writers and as readers because we want to expand our worldview. We want to imagine beyond what we are told at this moment is possible. And I find that an even more compelling argument when it comes to the historical record, because so much has been deliberately erased or lost. You know, so much of the historical record is white and male, and there are stories that by this point are no longer sadly recoverable to us by facts. And so as much as historians should work to recover those actual facts, you know, it is up to artists, it is up to writers to sort of, you have to do it carefully, right? You have to do it through an act of incredible craft, and you have to do it through empathy, and you have to do it through hard work, but sort of expand the imagination of those eras.
I love that so much. Whenever I'm like, oh my gosh, am I getting all the facts right? I kind of come back to what you said and just remember, like, this is a work of fiction, and it is my fiction that I'm working on.
Yeah, and it is funny too, again, like when you do it correctly, how many resonances there can be. I remember when I was working on this book, you know, there are some acts of very racist violence against the immigrant family in it. And I remember when I was writing the first draft, I was actually worried that I had done some, you know, included scenes that were like too maudlin, too melodramatic, that wouldn't feel believable, that maybe I was just trying to force, you know, I would question myself, like, am I trying to force quote unquote a message? And then it was funny because not funny, haha, but like awful funny, that I would look back in the historical record and find cases of like terrible acts of violence, even like cruder and perhaps in a sense less believable than the ones I had created in fiction.
Yeah, I definitely came upon that as well. Yeah. Speaking about the book itself, the story itself, I think one of the most memorable and just like honestly perfect to me parts of the book are its characters, Ba, Ma, Sam, and Lucy. And you know, since we're talking about what does it mean to belong to the West, I noticed like they all have very different relationships to how they see themselves and see themselves in the West. I was wondering if you could talk more about how you were thinking through these characters and their relationships to their surroundings, and like what it meant for them to belong to the West.
Yeah, I think that it's sometimes people ask me sort of like, what is like my answer or the answer to this question of like, yeah, how do you belong to the West when you're an immigrant or you don't look like the dominant culture? And the thing is, like, I don't have an answer as an author. I think that one of the functions of the novel is in fact to explore these open-ended questions and sort of leave a space of ambiguity in which the reader can form their own opinions, start to sort of add their own thoughts to the story. And so I didn't do it exactly intentionally, but it is true that I think that all of the four primary characters of the novel do have a different point of view on that. And it really did start from a character perspective with Sam and Lucy, the two siblings. You know, I talked about how that first scene just came to me, and there was already tension in that first scene because they're two siblings of such great contrast, right? It was really important for me to, in Lucy, show this desire for assimilation that I think a lot of Asian immigrants, and particularly Asian immigrants who are female presenting, feel. She for so long buys into this belief that true belonging comes through imitating, right, the dominant narrative and the dominant populace enough that she can sort of invisibly blend into them, even if that's not who she is. And it's interesting because you want in your novel to have characters that have views that are not your own, right? But then at the same time, you don't want those views to be the only ones in the novel. You don't want them to take up all the air. So Sam was sort of this breath of fresh air for me from that perspective, almost the opposite of Lucy, where Sam truly believes in being fully themselves at every point. And there is danger in that too, in a world in which there is violence on all sides, where Lucy sort of psychologically perhaps suffers more harm than Sam, but Sam, because they are fighting the dominant culture, is oftentimes a more physical harm. So it was really interested in showing those two different parts of the spectrum.
And in the end, I mentioned the ending at the beginning, but Lucy, spoiler alert for those who haven't read this book, Lucy manages to pay off the debt that Sam incurs. And Sam is already in China by this point, I think. And Lucy is, for one moment, she allows herself to think of China as like home, and realizes that she cannot do it and that it will not be her home. And so instead she kind of like turns back to the West, but almost sees it in a new light. That ending, you know, the first time I read it, I was kind of like, this is devastating. And then this most recent time, I kind of thought it was kind of triumphant. I'm curious how you were thinking about that ending, and like how both of their arcs come to completion.
Yeah, that ending was very hard for me to write. It was the very first ending that came to me. And then in subsequent revisions, I kept sort of poking at it and wondering if there was another way, another sort of, for lack of better words, happier way to end the story. But, you know, the thing is, like, the events of the novel are one arc of these characters' lives. They are not the entire characters' lives. And I think that for me, a work will always be most successful if it feels to the reader that those characters continue to live lives off the page, that they can have, you know, many more novels potentially written about them. And so Lucy, to that, was me. You know, we talked a little bit about how she is this character who is so deeply sort of warped by her desire to assimilate into white society. And her arc is really this one where at the end, she finally has this moment of realizing that she can assert herself, she can assert her desires. And for all the tragedy that has befallen her, and for all the sort of ways that she is more alone, she is also in a way more independent and more free to make choices without thinking of others first. And so I would agree with you there. That feels triumphant to me. You know, it isn't sort of triumphant perhaps materially in terms of the actions on the page, but what is the novel if not a vehicle through which to show the emotional triumphs of people, right? The sort of emotional movements in a way that no other medium can.
That's so beautiful. Yes. I had a thought when we were talking about Lucy's desire to assimilate. I was remembering the character of Teacher Lee, and never have I wanted to reach through the page and just cause harm on another fictional character. But I was curious, for those of you, again, who haven't read this, Teacher Lee is this school teacher who is working on this ethnography, a record of, I guess, like people who are not white, or people in the region rather. And he takes a particular interest in Lucy and Ma, and kind of tries to get them to fit into his narrative. And when they don't, he rejects them. Pam, like, how did you come to this character? What was your, I mean, just tell me about like how you were working with that character.
I mean, you know, in some ways the character is, so there are many modes of violence in this book, right? And there's the most obvious ones are, you know, the characters come in and physically assault the characters, rob our family, who rob them, who do something physical. And then there are these, and their intention is never good. It's been malicious from the start. And then I was really interested in writing this other kind of character through Teacher Lee, this well-meaning character who does harm without ill intent, which can be in some ways more insidious and more dangerous, because it means that Lucy has built up this trust in Teacher Lee first. So when that trust is betrayed, it's much more harmful to her psychological health. So Teacher Lee is this character who, again, thinks that he is helping elevate a family from the margins, but who at the end of the day, his purpose is probably more about elevating himself through the use of this family and sort of thinking of himself as a white savior. He's not an evil character. I wanted to be able to show characters that were shades of gray on the other side of the family as well. And I think that, you know, especially, I do think that the Asian American experience specifically, and the Asian American female experience specifically, you do in our day and age often deal with more of that kind of violence, the subtle psychological violence inflicted by people like Teacher Lee, than the outright physical violence. I mean, just, I don't feel like I have to explain this to you, Jenny, but just the number of sort of microaggressions that you encounter along the way, terrible racist things disguised as backhanded compliments. That is sort of those are the kind of lived experiences that I feel like come out through characters like Teacher Lee.
Yes, and I feel like it was really smart of you to kind of show like his fascination with Ma, and like how he was also fascinated with Lucy, but they were kind of like different. There were nuances to that as well, which it made me think about like my mom when she came to America. She was a graduate student, and like she didn't notice these types of microaggressions that like I would notice now, because she didn't know to look for them. So I kind of saw that reflected as well.
Yeah, and the fact that as a graduate student, I'm guessing that some of these microaggressions were sort of, in a way, they were coming from the institutions, I'm guessing. That's, I don't actually know your mom's story, but that's sort of what happens through Teacher Lee as well. He is someone with a social standing. He is a teacher. He is someone of authority. Even in this case, often of like sort of implied moral authority. And that's a very interesting dynamic as well.
Yeah. So I wanted to pivot to the dialogue in this book. I noticed that there's this nice balance of Mandarin Chinese and English in the four main characters when they're speaking to one another. And I know, like there's kind of been pushback recently around whether or not writers who speak more than one language, whether we need to explain what our languages mean to readers who don't speak that language, whether we need to italicize, whether we need to have footnotes. And the pushback has been like, no, the readers should do the work of translation themselves. And I really enjoyed in your book how it was just kind of like a seamless, like it would just be in the sentence. And maybe that's because I am a Mandarin speaker. So I felt like there were two levels of the sentence where it was like the dialogue as it was, and then there was like that emotional layer when you add like the 亲爱的 or like 听我 Lucy Girl, stuff like that. So I'm really curious, how are you thinking about the weight of like what to give Mandarin, what to give English in these sentences as you're writing?
Yeah, one really important and actually stylistically really fun part of the project at the beginning was really getting this, I call it sort of pidgin Mandarin, mixed into the English, because that was the language that I heard around my household growing up. And I think that, like the readers are important, obviously, and consideration of the readers does come later. But for me, as selfish as it sounds, when you're first embarking upon a project that is so painstaking, that takes so many years of your life, the most important person to please is yourself. And so I took a lot of pleasure in being able to put the language I heard growing up on the page in a way that I very, very, very rarely see. And it gives me a lot of joy when, readers who have a similar background feel that. I want them to feel that that is something special for them, that is a life experience of theirs they've seen reflected. And I don't think that takes away from its comprehensibility to other readers. I don't think that takes away from the universality of these emotions. I think I heard someone saying recently that in response to that sort of question of like, well, what if people don't understand? It is more true to much of the world. I live in cities, but I go around, I hear so many languages around me all the time, every day. And I don't just mean, actual different languages, like, but also you might see a mother and her child talking in a checkout line in the middle of a fight, and they're using the language of their family. They're referencing, something that you don't quite understand as an outside observer, but you can read into the emotions of it. You can understand the sort of gist of their passions. And we should trust our readers more, because that's not off-putting. That's exciting. It's very cool to sort of, I think, have that experience of pressing your ear against a wall and sort of peeking into someone else's life. And I trust readers, and I love it when authors trust their readers like that. So at the end of the day, yes, when I made the final pass through the book, I did sort of make sure that there are enough context clues that I don't think the Mandarin impedes. The Mandarin does not impede anyone's understanding, but for people who understand Mandarin, it can sort of enrich it. It can be a special Easter egg, and that was the effect that I was going for.
Yeah, I felt like it was almost a cue of like how to hear the sentence in a different way. Yeah, it was really beautifully done. You know, on the topic of voice and like trusting your reader, of course, in the beginning of part 3, we hear from Ba. Like he has a whole section where he is speaking from the grave to Lucy and explaining to her, like, this is how your mother and I came to be in this country. What was the thinking around like giving him that section rather than say Ma?
Yeah, I think that the book starts out with Ba's death and the discovery of his death by these 2 children, and they're sort of reckoning with not only the facts of the death but the very physical presence of that body. And so, again, like the book covers one arc of these characters' lives where there may be many arcs, and certainly Ma's a really important character. But in the arc of this book, it was in a way these children coming to terms with the death of their father. And it was that struggle where, as a writer for the other 3 sections of the book, it was important for me to deliver those sections through Lucy's point of view. But also as a writer, I wanted a chance to tell this story and sort of show the reader how there were depths to their parents' history that the children hadn't been able to access. And I wanted to show that contrast, which I think is just such a painful and also true contrast for many of us in our lives with our parents, because there is that generational gap. And for a lot of us who are the children of immigrants, there's also this enormous culture gap, which seems at times, sort of uncrossable. And it was important for me to be able to give this piece of storytelling to Ba.
So, on the topic of, we kind of talked about this at the beginning, historical fiction, I found in an interview you did with Book Page earlier in April, you said, I sometimes worry that the classification of historical or immigrant overshadows another crucial theme of the book, how human activity in the name of profit has ravaged the land. And now, we're coming upon the end of the year, and all of these best of lists are coming out left and right, and your book is on them deservedly. And I've noticed it will often be under historical fiction. Do you find yourself kind of grappling with its classification as historical fiction? And what does, I guess, historical fiction mean to you in this case?
Yeah, it's hard. I think it's kind of less, maybe my beef isn't with that particular label so much as it is, and you'll experience this, I'm sure, when your book comes out, the particular pain of thinking of any private work of art in one particular way, and then seeing it turn out into the world and have its own narrative attached to it, which even if it's a perfectly good narrative, you're like, no, that's different than what I thought it was going to be. So I'm mostly over it, but I think that this is part of it. We also live in a book industry culture in which books are often shrunken to a 2-sentence description. And in that sentence, the themes that sort of leap out at people are historical and are immigrants, because I don't actually know why. I guess it's just sort of the marketplace, to be honest. That's what the marketplace is. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think that we live in an age in which climate change is so inescapable. I remember I was in a graduate school class maybe 5 or 6 years ago now, and I had this wonderful professor who was a sort of history and a history professor, but he was really interested in climate change, and he was asking why don't we have more climate change novels? Why are sort of fiction writers lagging behind this movement? And now in 2020, right, it's a term now, it's cli-fi. Is the term. Have you heard that? Cli-fi is the term for it. And certainly when I was working on this book, I think it was fire. There have been wildfires in California, I think 5 consecutive years running now. And when I was revising through years 1, 2, and 3 of them. And to me, they were always such a big part of the heart of this book, this tragedy of the Western landscape that I think is you can sort of see hints of it even in the classics of the literature, like Steinbeck, like in Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove. But the sort of older books of the genre, you can see the climate change, but it isn't sort of discussed as explicitly, isn't looked at as directly, but it's all there. So much of the Western genre, I feel, is about, right, the sadness of losing this untrammeled, pristine landscape. And the old sadness used to be just like, oh man, like our old fun landscape is gone. But I think the new prescient sadness is like, oh no, it's gone, and it's going to kill us. Like the fact that it's gone is also going to kill us. I don't even know where I'm going with this anymore, except to say that, yeah, climate change, it is a huge part of the novel to me. I think it's part of the nostalgia and the sadness of the Western genre. And this is a kind of interesting age to focus on that.
There is something to be said about like the myth of the West, which is, I think from the outside, it's like kind of this glorious, like untenable land that you kind of have to like fight to conquer almost. And then in this book, it's like the reality of the land, which is like there are floods, there's many rainstorms, there's just like mud everywhere. It's there's the myth and then there's the reality. And I think your novel does show like this is like what humans happening upon the land can do to the land.
Yeah, I think we all have such mythologized notions, certainly of the West, but just of the outdoors in general. You know, I grew up in a family where we didn't hike when I was a child. Like, what was hiking? Why would you spend money on shoes and drive 2 hours to just like go walk around? That wasn't a thing that my family did. But obviously, you know, I grew up in American culture where I would hear friends talk about it, where I would see, you know, movies where there are all these like kind of beautiful like camp settings and settings by lakes. And when I was an adult, right, I went hiking. I was like, I've always wanted to do this. I'm going to love it. The wilderness is great. And lo and behold, like when you get down to it, the wilderness is like sticky and filled with bugs, and it's cold, and you're tired, and you're hungry. But I think that what was really interesting was that seeing that cultural depiction of the wilderness, and then for my whole life, and then meeting the reality as an adult, made me appreciate the delta between the two, and also gave me like a huge sense of awe for the West. I think because it wasn't sort of like my friendly neighborhood outdoors that I went to every summer. As an adult, I met it as this like magnificent but also kind of terrifying, fearsome being. Like nature is really freaking scary. And I don't think that at all takes away from how beautiful or amazing or precious it is. If anything, I think those all sort of you know, support one another. But it is sort of like terrifying and brutal, and that's what's fascinating about it.
Yeah, I remember when I did my MFA in Wyoming. I remember like being so in awe of the land, but the awe was because I knew it could kill me if I didn't watch, if I like didn't actively, if I just like I needed to actively pay attention and like understand how to survive in this land.
Exactly. And I think that word attention is key, right? What are novels? What is any art but an act of very deep, almost otherworldly attention to something? And I think that is why the West and the outdoors and climate change are such fertile grounds for works of fiction.
Does this mean your next novel will be about climate change?
Probably not, but I think it's more that. I feel like it's very hard to be a contemporary writer and not have climate change be part of your novel in the same way. To me, it's a little bit like asking, right, well, like eating and drinking be part of your novel, or will like character emotions be part of your novel? It's kind of like, how can it not be? Unless, I don't know, you're writing a book about two people who live in an isolated cell and see nobody else and receive no news about
right. It's kind of like it's become the fabric of reality now. Yeah. Since this is a talk about, you know, what does it mean to belong in the West? I know like when I was writing my Catapult column about living in Wyoming, and even now, like as I'm working on this novel about Idaho for the most part, I feel almost like I don't have the authority to like write about these spaces, even though I've done the research or I lived there, because traditionally they have been portrayed in a very white way. Like when I think about John Wayne and cowboys and like even Brokeback Mountain, which was directed by Ang Lee, but still like portrays two white men. Did you ever, as you were writing this, did you ever find yourself kind of coming upon those questions of like, almost like, am I allowed? How will I like do this?
Oh yeah, certainly. And I think to me, one of my ways around this is from the beginning, I told myself, this is a reimagined history. So I kind of like, that allowed me, just that label internally for many years at first, allowed me to take a half step outside and sort of look at my deviances from the conventional genre as deliberate, which they were, deliberate deviances and exciting deviances, rather than, oh, I made a mistake here, right? Which I think is often the default when you are trying to write into a genre that has such a rich and broad history of work. So I think that little mental trick that you play on yourself is really, at the end of the day, important. And for me also then, because I went in, like, I am deliberately going to sort of explode parts of this genre, I ended up having a lot of fun with it. For example, even the syntax of the book, the prose style came out of that. You know, I really love that sort of like pulpy, slangy, Wild West jargon that you find in all those works. But I was like, what can I do to sort of twist this up a little bit, make it both more contemporary and more distinct, more unique to me. And the way I did that was, you know, one, by incorporating that Pidgin Mandarin that we talked about earlier, which just changes it a little bit, refreshes it. And then two, for the sake of the character Sam, taking gendered pronouns out of a lot of his speech. So that just kind of like cut up this like kind of old Westy, like trademark, old copyright, old West slang, and made it my own. I guess one analogy is just sort of like, you know, taking old vintage clothes and sort of like cutting them, remaking them. It can be fun if you say sort of like, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make a new outfit. I'm not trying to literally replicate this Prada dress from 1982.
Yes, and I feel like you did that so well here. Like it reads, the atmosphere and everything about it reads like the West, but you've completely just, I think, like exploded the genre. I think that's the best way to describe it. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it can be fun. So I hope that you have fun, though. I also will say that you will probably have moments when you doubt yourself, but I don't think there is a writer that exists without doubt, and doubt can be healthy. But yeah. Actually, honestly, reading your interviews, especially around how you're dealing with like the historical fiction and the research portion of it, has been really helpful in me kind of stepping back and saying like, yes, this can be like inspired by events, but it's also my story to tell.
Yeah. I know you know this, but just like saying it again for the benefit of everyone, but also like, you know, the John Wayne classics, they're not actually they're not more factual than anything you're writing. If anything, they're very false. I think I'm going to get the exact date wrong, but right, sort of like the era of like cowboys lassoing cattle and having shootouts, that era actually was a very small period in time. I think it was only a couple of decades. It's just really the myth of it that has been exploded out of proportion.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I think we all needed to hear it. So this is kind of, this will be my last question because I want to make sure we have time for audience questions. You know, I don't think any of us could have predicted that when your book came out, like lockdown was going to go into full effect, COVID was raging on, and then we have a soon-to-be former president who's calling the coronavirus like the Kung flu, the Chinese virus, the Chinese flu. And that anti-Chinese and anti-Asian sentiment would be like rising across the country. And your book is set against this world where our main characters are treated differently for the way they look, for their eyes, for their skin color. It almost, I definitely experienced this when I was like finishing my first draft of the book around this time, and I realized like the things I'm writing about are actually happening before my eyes. There's no like time jump at all. So I'm curious, like, what did that feel like for you as you're kind of seeing all of this happen, and like you have already written this story, but it's almost like it's happening in front of your eyes still?
Yeah, it has definitely been a wild ride to see this, especially as I said before, coming from the place where my first draft I worried about being sort of too extreme in the depictions of violence. It's one of those things that it's like a sickening sense of recognition, right? It's like, yes, intellectually, when you look at the fabric of this country, it makes, you could have predicted that this would be happening this year. This sort of violent xenophobia and rhetoric would be happening this year, and yet that doesn't stop it hurting. Like, being right doesn't lessen the sting of that. It's definitely been very strange. You know, just like a funny story, I was very lucky to have a New York Times profile of myself before the book came out, and the photographer who took my picture for that in San Francisco, I think a couple of weeks earlier, had shot this woman in San Francisco, this Chinese American woman living in San Francisco, who had been spat on and, you know, called racist slurs. And it was just like, yes, those two sides, the history that we're writing about and the history that is unfolding today, they're just like vibrating with the same resonances, and it's very, very strange. You know, I don't think we have to take a positive lesson from everything, but I think that perhaps one of the good things that may come out of this year and the occurrences of it, as at least we're talking about it, right? I think that, you know, especially as Asian Americans, so oftentimes we're told that our experience of racism are like very minor, like even the term microaggression. Sometimes I kind of hate that term, because like the term by itself diminishes what is happening. For Asian Americans, for many of us, our experiences are more of these microaggressions, and I think that has meant that we don't talk about, you know, the very unquestionably racist rhetoric that underlies even like innocent, casual microaggressions. We don't often talk about the very real possibility of violence, and now we're forced to talk about it. We're forced to confront it, right? And I hope that conversation itself will do some good, raise some awareness, especially within Asian American communities. So I promise I won't go too far down this route, but who, you know, historically have not been great voters. I think this conversation is an interesting one.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm gonna go to our chat and see if we have any questions.
Jenny, I have a question myself, if you don't mind me.
Please, Garrett. Garrett's voice.
I can't help myself.
Hi, Garrett.
Hello, I returned. So I mean, I was always here, but Pam, I was curious about your table of contents, which I think is like #1 on my table of contents power rankings for all time. And which I'm just forming now, but I know yours is on the top of it. Yeah, for those who aren't familiar. And I was wondering how the convention of chapter titles emerged, and whether it like functioned as a constraint in the process, perhaps. Yeah,
no, that's a great question. I love talking about that. Yes, it was a constraint I introduced really late in the process. I guess like the big thing I'll say is like, I'm a huge believer in when you're in the process of crafting a novel, of just like using any device you can to get yourself to the end, often making up devices to just sort of get yourself across the finish line. And these chapter titles were one of those. So they came very late, several drafts into the process. I already had a completed manuscript. I had the world, I had sort of all the major plot points, and I was feeling that the work was getting kind of baggy. It was getting a little bit shapeless now that, you know, sort of like things had been clarified, sections had been added. And so I put in these chapter titles. They were supposed to be sort of work artifacts of the work in progress. I meant to take them out later, but the sort of idea was that I would put a word there and it would become sort of my North Star for that title. You know, if a chapter is named like plum, it doesn't actually mean that there's necessarily a plum in it, but it would be something I would sort of like be thinking about. It would just sort of make everything in that chapter tighten around it. And so I put them in as placeholders, and then sort of later in the process discovered that they really worked for me. And so in every section except the third section, the chapter titles repeat, but they have different orders, they reference different things. And it really spoke to one theme of the novel that was important to me, this theme of sort of intergenerational trauma and, mistakes, grievances being repeated, or brought to life in different ways throughout stages of one person's life or through generations of a family. So they were a fun device that I meant to throw away, but they ended up being really useful. Thank you for the question, Garrett.
No. Amazing.
I have a question about, since we're on the topic of kind of structure and how you put the book together, like how did you come to this? It's non-linear, each of the parts. How did you come to that? Was that always going to be the case, or did you find like as you were writing the story, that's what it demanded?
Yeah, definitely didn't plan it. It kind of just ended up being that way. But in general, I love works that begin right in the middle of the scene, which the book really does start with a literal bang. And I don't know, it's just a personal preference. I personally don't like to sort of like set up background before things have happened. I just like love background to be explained along the way. So it just felt natural to me to have this structure where sort of I feel like you have the action and then you have a deeper understanding of it through seeing the slice of the family's past in part 2, and then an even deeper understanding of it through seeing another earlier slice of the family's history and so on.
So we have an audience question here from Michael. To what degree did Western character archetypes influence the characters? Did you actively seek to explode or expand those archetypes?
Yeah, definitely. I had a lot of fun with it. So like, Sam was my take on the swaggering cowboy, and it was really fun to see like, I guess, yeah, to see what someone who is, what we today would call sort of either trans or non-binary play with this like ultra hyper masculine stereotype. And I think that in some ways Sam is the ideal person to play with that because of their sort of biological gender. Sam is so aware of the tropes of masculine and feminine presentations and so aware of the different sort of powers and the sort of different levers that can be pulled when they are read as either a woman or a man. And so I'm exploding those tropes through Sam, but I think Sam is also deliberately like yanking on all the ropes, and that was just really fun to do.
It was like Sam knew everything I felt like Sam just knew everything and had everything planned out already.
In a way, in a way, I feel like it is often the case that when you have marginalized populations, when you have outsiders in society, I think they often see the sort of the foundation and the puppet strings of society much more clearly than someone who is in it, right? For whom it's all seamless. But when you're stepping outside of it, you see everything.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer. Let's see. Any other questions?
I have a question just because,
Yeah.
So we're talking about the American West, and I'm wondering, do we dare define what that means? You've been talking kind of about like the myth of the American West and cowboys and climate change, which is very, it's timeless, but it's also very timely. And so I'm wondering, do we even try to define what the American West means now, either by what, natural state we're in, environmental state, or by what it is not? I'm wondering what your thoughts about that kind of definition or like characterization actually looks like.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Honestly, I'm all for people using whatever labels they want to use for the most part, as long as it's not harmful to either themselves or somebody else. And so I think that to me, I'm like, have at it, have at it, whatever you want to call the American West. I don't know, Jenny, do you have thoughts on that?
Gosh, I've been trying to figure this out, and honestly, I feel like it's just undefinable. And I was thinking about the line in your book where it was like, there's being claimed by the land and there's claiming the land. I think I'm mutating that line, but it's the claiming of the land was what stuck out to me. And I feel like because like the American West, the land itself does not belong to any of us who are not part of indigenous tribes who lived in that area and were in that area first. I feel like it's like folly to try to claim it in that way by giving it like a new name or a new definition. It's just, again, I feel like all we can do is like survive in it and like let that be enough.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, do we have any more questions? I don't see any in the Q&A, so maybe this is a good time to wrap it up. Thank you both for that conversation. It was wonderful to listen to. Pam, congratulations on your book, on the success of it. Jenny, congratulations on selling your book, and I'm sure everyone that's watching, who is watching, is looking forward to that. Thank you, Garrett, for being here and introducing Pam and Jenny. This is kind of an outro for me regarding the Adroit Journal, just because I'm no longer a part of it. So in that case, it's a little bittersweet, but I'm so glad that we were able, all of us, to meet here tonight. Thank you everyone watching and participating. Just as a reminder, you can purchase How Much of These Hills is Gold online at Fact and Fiction's website, factandfictionbooks.com. Remember to put MBF in the code at checkout. And then I also urge you to purchase Montana Book Festival merchandise, montanabookfestival.com. There you can also donate. Again, I really want to continue programming like this into the future, into 2021. I know we're all looking forward to it. So again, thank you, the three of you. Thank you, audience, for being here. I hope everyone has a really wonderful night.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.